Hello and welcome. I'm Asuma Katauka and you're watching China Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of this hour. Brazil has approved the Chinese Navy's 178-meter hospital ship Ark Silk Road to dock in Rio de Janeiro from January 8 to 15th. Meanwhile, the U.S. oceanographic ship Ronald H. Brown is set to arrive in Suape from January 14 to 21, highlighting growing China-U.S. naval activity in South America. Investigators in Hong Kong have now revealed that the Boeing 747 cargo plane suddenly accelerated to 106 to 107% thrust on engine 4 after landing, causing the aircraft to veer off the runway and kill 2 airport workers last month, as a full investigation is still underway. The U.S. has withdrawn its Typhoon mid-range missile system from Iwakuni, Japan, a launcher capable of firing 1,800 km range Tomahawk and SM-6 missiles. The system, first deployed for the Resolute Dragon 2025 exercise, remained on the side beyond the planned withdrawal amid rising tensions between Beijing and Tokyo. China resumes buying U.S. soybeans as media reports suggest. China bought 14 cargo ships carrying U.S. soybeans on Monday, which is the highest since January, as this move by China gives an ease over earlier Trump-Xi summit outcomes and the discussed issue of U.S. farm products amid heightened tensions among U.S. farmers. Chinese Premier Li Qiang told President Vladimir Putin while visiting the Kremlin that China is determined to pursue mutually beneficial cooperation with Russia, as both sides praised their comprehensive strategic partnership and recent high-level meetings between their presidents, as both countries vowed to continue cooperation. Chinese Premier Li Qiang has told Mongolian Prime Minister Gomboja Zandan-Shatar that China is ready to expand trade, boost cooperation and align development strategies to strengthen their comprehensive strategic partnership, while Mongolia also reaffirmed its One China policy, praised China's support and vowed to deepen cooperation. Oman has announced it is open to Chinese archaeological cooperation, with official delegation inviting Chinese scholars to join projects as Oman promotes its 5 UNESCO World Heritage Sites. According to Japan's Fire and Disaster Management Agency, a massive fire tore through more than 170 buildings in the Saganoseki district of Oita, Japan, forcing 175 residents to evacuate and leaving 1 person missing. The blaze, which began around 5:40 p.m. local time on Tuesday, which prompted Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi to deploy a military firefighting helicopter. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that China is on schedule to buy farm products from the United States. Trump has told Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to tell China to speed up the purchase of farm products. He has also added that the United States' relationship with China has been good. This comes as Trump had earlier removed tariffs on some foreign agricultural products, including staples such as beef and coffee. The White House released a list of farm goods that would no longer be subject to 10% reciprocal tariffs levied on trading partners. The tariff rollback went into effect immediately. Now for this discussion, we welcome Dr. and Professor Asta Chadha. She's a Ritsumeikan and Associate Professor of International Relations, joins us live from Kyoto, Japan. Thank you very much, Dr. Asta, for joining us again. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Asma.
Now, what do you think? What is happening with U.S.-China? Do you think U.S. is just pressuring without a specific plan that they have agreed on China to accelerate the farm product purchases, or do you think they have a proper timeline and plan in place?
Yeah, thanks, Asuma.
Thank you.
If you look at how President Trump has been, handling his foreign policy with a combination of economic coercive measures and, a possibility of conflict escalation with any of the countries that are not willing to cooperate with the United States, it looks only obvious and only, correct for United States then under President Trump to expect its partners and specifically strategic partners that could also be strategic rivals to be able to trade and help United States, establish its, if you've been following the MAGA sort of objective that has pretty much been to revive the US economy and put it at the center of all these trade deals that President Trump has been trying to strike. So given the fact that China is willing to do the same and the United States is cooperating, it should only be seen within its economic sphere and nothing beyond it, because their strategic rivalry still remains intact.
And do you think should U.S. pressure China to accelerate farm product purchases, or do you think that this could happen, that it will force China to determine the pace of of the purchases of U.S. goods?
At this moment, as long as China is willing to cooperate and, agree to buying some of those products or import the US farm products, I think US is going to be content. We might probably see more coercion and probably more tariff threats if China rolls back its policy. And let's remember, this US-China relationship, howsoever entangled it is not just in the economic sphere. They also have a lot of disagreements in the strategic sphere, specifically when we talk about the Indo-Pacific security issues. So anything that happens on the geopolitical or security front is likely to impact the geo-economic and the trade front and vice versa. So any possibility of President Trump or the Trump administration to further coerce China remains open, but not in the very short run.
And what are the political long-term effects if U.S. keeps, relying on China to buy their farm goods? And is there any other country that U.S. can look into to kind of counterbalance depending on China like this in terms of their farm goods?
Well, we do remember that earlier President Trump wanted to strike a trade deal with India as well. And we know that India has been, at least the agricultural sector in India is a very sensitive subject, and it's not really open as the other sector in terms of private investment and imports. So we know that deal did not go through exactly how President Trump wanted, and the next biggest market in those terms is China. Though US does have other markets across the globe, but none as big as China and India in terms of the population and in terms of the production of or consumption of farm products. That's one. Two, it does seem that the Trump presidency needs to rethink probably, its strategy, because too much heavy reliance on China pretty much goes against US's own vision in the longer run or even in the medium run to de-risk dependence on China and de-risk and separate their, not exactly decouple, but in some way maintain alternative supply chains and alternative trade partners. And the fact that US is now currently, going back on its word in some ways, at least in terms of trade, and trying to have China as its main partner or China as a very key partner, just shows yet again how dependent and interdependent those two countries are, howsoever much tighter their strategic rivalry might be, but their geo-economic entanglements remain very much intact.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for emphasizing that and bringing that up. Dr. Chadha, please stay with us as we come back to you for our next discussion as well. Now, moving on, Chinese Premier Li Qiang says that China's determination and position on developing mutual beneficial cooperation with Russia have always been consistent. These remarks came during his meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. He has also urged both sides to jointly host new China-Russia national level theme years, leverage mutually beneficial policies such as visa-free access, promoting better mutual understanding and closer ties between the people of two countries, and also consolidate the foundation of people-to-people friendship in bilateral relations. Meanwhile, President Putin congratulated Xi for the successful convening of the fourth plenary session of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China and expressed his confidence in President Xi's strong leadership. Now for this discussion, we welcome back Dr. and Professor Asta Chadda. She's a Ritsumeikan University Associate Professor of International Relations, joins us live from Kyoto. Thank you very much, Professor, for staying with us. Professor, now looking at this, how do you analyze the growing cooperation and relationship between Russia and China?
I mean, Russia and China have remained partners as far as their, bilateral relations are concerned. Their relations have been pretty stable, but we saw an uptick and rather elevation in that bilateral relationship since 2022. When Russia-Ukraine conflict began, and since then, these two countries, in the face of, specific kinds of whether economic sanctions or a lot of backlash from the Western world, they've tried to kind of inch closer to each other in terms of maintaining their certain influence and presence within the Indo-Pacific. And so I see this China-Russia development, or the fact that they are still willing to cooperate, as yet another policy of continuity that both of them may have maintained in their foreign policy, which is very much anti-West and very much aimed at strengthening non-Western institutions, specifically based on the fact that both of them maintain their, communist stronghold over their politics.
Yeah, and now it seems like they are emphasizing on increasing people-to-people exchanges. What do we know so far about the people-to-people exchanges between these two countries?
Well, I mean, Russian policy, and I would say it is more on the Russian front. And I mean, in terms of people-to-people exchanges, there are several aspects to it, right? One is the cultural exchange. The other part of it is the educational exchange. And then you have other ideas such as, language exchange, and making sure that both the countries have sort of an understanding, both at a domestic level as well. And there is sort of this cooperation is, in some ways, it's a PR, in some way, of branding of the nation in each other's countries. And China and Russia have maintained that relationship just the way so have India and Russia. But specifically in case of China and Russia, it has become even more important, because remember that these two countries have certain strategic objectives that remain, very much in place and have only strengthened since 2022. And some of them being the fact that they both want to counter the Western hegemony. That's one. Two, both of them would most likely support, and I cannot say if they would intervene, but would most likely support each other's interventionist policies, whether it's about Russia's policy towards Ukraine, or whether it's China's policy towards Taiwan, or surrounding East China Sea dispute or South China Sea disputed territories. We don't see them ever commenting or ever, expressing their displeasure at each other's actions. And the fact that they're willing to extend this to a domestic level and to kind of, attract more youth from each other's countries, be it for education exchange or cultural exchange, just shows that they are looking at this relationship in terms of a very long-term partnership that they can maintain. And then lastly, they both do have a lot of stake when it comes to regional security, because remember, they share the stage, whether it's at the BRICS together with India, or if it's at the SCO. Again, where India is also engaged. So the fact that the BRICS and SCO do remain strong and in some way coherent towards China's vision of Chinese leadership is also in part supported by the fact that Russia is very much there as a strategic partner to China.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for bringing that up. The long-term partnership between them, and that they seem to be very confident about the fact that they can maintain this in long term. How do you think this deepening China-Russia cooperation is reshaping global power balances in terms of ongoing tensions with Western nations?
Absolutely. I think you highlighted it, you put it better than I could. This partnership specifically remains at the core of any other non-Western led, sort of global order or challenge to the global order that remains, or a US led hegemonic order that exists in the world since post-Cold War. So the fact that, I mean, Russia, we know that it's not as strong as it used to be earlier, but at the same time, Russia does maintain certain very important capabilities, including nuclear capabilities. So as a nuclear nation and as a military nation, Russia remains very, very important. However, there are issues on the economic front, given that the Western world has put severe sanctions, and those have kind of continued and only worsened for Russia in the past 3 years or so since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And on part of China, we saw that at least before Trump administration, the rhetoric, at least in the United States, was very, very one-sided in terms of them wanting to counter Chinese influence in the wider Indo-Pacific and even globally, right? And hence we saw
Yes.
many of the Western world countries did not want to join any Chinese-led initiatives, including the Belt and Road initiatives, and there was a lot of caution around, partnering with China beyond pure trade and beyond pure economics. So now the fact that we have Trump administration and we see a lot of weakening of the US influence, I wouldn't say US presence, but definitely weakening of US influence. Also in some way, there's a lot of doubt in a lot of countries in the world with regard to the longer term prospects of a US-led partnership or a relationship in terms of security. China and Russia and their partnership and them coming and pitching themselves as the alternative to that Western hegemonic order definitely does send ripples across, the globe. Plus, we must not forget that both China and Russia are always keen to include India, whether it's in the SCO or whether it's in the BRICS. It's another matter that India wants to maintain its own independent foreign policy. But the fact that these three countries are usually seen together when it comes to voicing any concerns regarding the Western-led hegemonic order does show or does reflect a sort of very monumental change that has occurred geopolitically in the world, specifically when we talk about the liberal international order.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for bringing India into the conversation as well. Dr. Chadha, please stay with us as we come back to you. And now we stay on this topic. Russian liquefied natural gas producer Novatek has slashed the prices of its cargoes by 30% to 40% since August to entice Chinese buyers to purchase sanctioned gas from its Arctic LNG 2 project. According to reports, the purchases have provided commercial opportunities for the $21 billion project, which is subject to some of the strictest sanctions imposed by the US and Europe on Russia. At the same time, Washington is seeking to limit oil and gas revenue to the Kremlin as US President Donald Trump increases pressure on Moscow to end its war with Ukraine. The White House has also indicated possible actions against countries that continue to buy Russian energy exports. Now for this discussion, we welcome back Dr. Asta Chadha. She's a Ritsumeikan University Associate Professor of International Relations. Thank you very much, Dr. Asta, for staying with us. Now, as we were just talking about how India is also in their a strategic player in between the relationship between China and Russia, how do you think this could affect India now as India continues to buy Russian oil?
Well, I mean, if we just roll it back a little bit to 2022, when the rest of the world suddenly got a shock in terms of rising oil prices, and there were sanctions put on Russia by United States, Europe, and a lot of other countries who joined in those sanctions. We do remember there was kind of a crisis, especially energy crisis, and given the fact that winter was coming, even Europe was in some way impacted by it to a larger extent, and they continued their little purchases from Russia, though it was very measured, but it did continue, right? So at that moment, India basically, though not too much in terms of volume, but definitely in terms of percentages that India used to import Russian energy, it did increase to a bit. So did Chinese. And the idea was to reroute this in some way and provide and keep the markets, the energy markets, stable. And that was at some point also acknowledged by United States, stating that it was India that allowed the energy markets to remain stable, right? But then comes the Trump presidency, and then we see that there are very selective in some way very partial and biased tariffs that have been put or were put on India in terms for buying Russian oil, whereas not the same was done for China or any other buyers. So we can probably just put the US tariff issues aside because, those seem to be way more political than having to do anything with US actually wanting to sanction Russia and its economy for the aggression in Ukraine. So it seems more like a US pressure tactic yet again under the Trump presidency, and it's very asymmetric. It is not in proportion to the kind of oil and or energy that any other country is buying. So India was singled out, and we know for a lot of other reasons, including the fact that India did not acknowledge President Trump's role, which, by the way, was not much in terms of negotiating any peace,
Yes.
in the conflict with Pakistan. That's one. Two, in terms of Chinese, buyers willing to increase their purchases of Russian LNG, I mean, you see, this is a strategic sort of a decision, but also a necessity on both sides. For China, them getting their hands on cheaper energy is very important because China does remain kind of the factory of the world. They need cheap energy, they need cheap gas to continue to function, and for their economy, it's a beneficial. It's a very beneficial decision. As far as Russia is concerned, we've heard several times that there are certain projects, there are certain places in Russia where unless the oil and gas machinery and the fact that they are pumping oil, unless those that aspect of industry remains functional, specifically the fact that winter is here, their pipelines, their whole infrastructure sort of freezes and is put on a hold, and it's a huge burden on their industry, their energy industry as well. So they need to continue to pump that oil, they need to continue to supply that, they need to continue to make sure that the Russian economy in some way is functional, it's functioning, and it's moving. So them finding a partner in India and them finding a partner in China is but obvious for both reasons, right? They need to continue to have a well-functioning economy, howsoever hit it might be because of the Western sanctions, but it also allows Russia to maintain its influence within the Indo-Pacific, given that it shows the world that it still has partners and it's not very dependent on the Western world in terms of its own functioning and in terms of its own stability domestically.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for connecting all the dots there. And now, adding China to conversation, you've already mentioned a little bit, but what do you think, what are the motives of China in continuing to deepen cooperation with Russia? As you also mentioned that one of them is China benefiting from discounted and sanctioned Russian LNG. Why does China continue to do so regardless of pressure from West, especially with the ties to them tying it to Ukraine, war in Ukraine?
I mean, there are three main reasons. I mean, there could be several, but three main are very, very, very pertinent here to mention. One is the fact that U.S. sanctions no longer seem. I mean, sanctions rarely work actually, but still, even symbolically, U.S. sanctions do not seem to be working, and China seems to have already caught the wind of the fact that it is that China is indispensable for U.S. economy too. So, given that fact, they do not seem to fear too much, Trump tariffs, or they do not seem to fear too much of retaliation when it comes to energy trade with Russia. That's one. Two, for China's own economy, it is a very, it's a win-win sort of a deal, to be able to continue to buy discounted purchases of energy. And it is important for their long-term energy security as well. And number three, this allows China to maintain that exactly what China had been trying to sort of symbolize and then project to the world, which is that it is an alternative powerhouse. And the fact that China can flout any of the Western sanctions and continue to maintain both its quintessential, importance within the global supply chains, despite sanctions, and continue to trade with countries that it wants to trade with, shows another level of strategic autonomy that China still wants to maintain, in terms of its own foreign policy. So on all the three fronts, it seems like a very strategic, but also very, in terms of very sort of, economic calculation, seems like a very obvious decision that China wants to continue what it has been wanting to continue. And lastly, all of these together allow China to project that it is another global power, and the older or the erstwhile system of this unipolar world is no longer remaining, or that's probably just a residue. And lastly, China is not alone in this. There are other countries that are very, very important. Specifically, when you look within BRICS, you have again, I'll bring in India here because again, in terms of strategic posturing, India remains very important. So these countries are in a way signaling to the world that the global order is not the same anymore, and China, specifically in terms of China, it's important for their domestic politics and their domestic economy as well that they continue to maintain a functioning relationship, and they continue to get purchases, discounted purchases, and the best deals that they can get for themselves. And look at what President Trump is doing. That's what he's doing. He's trying to get the best deals for his country. So China's logic is, if they can, why can't we?
Yes, indeed. And as you also mentioned that Russia has certain important leverage or capabilities that they can strategically continue to use, or continue to use. And as you just mentioned, that China is indeed a global power now. What political leverage does the U.S. gain or risk by threatening actions against these countries that continue to buying Russian energy? As you also mentioned earlier, that U.S. needs to rethink their strategy now.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, see, the US foreign policy, at least up until very recent, seemed relatively clear. If you read the US security strategy documents, they were very clear in terms of identifying the threats that US sees in the wider Indo-Pacific, and China and Russia were both named there, right there in those documents. But the fact that under Trump presidency, the very fundamentals of US foreign policy seem to have slightly shifted. It's no longer about strategically countering any other country in terms of its global influence or in terms of it challenging the status quo. The Trump presidency seems to be focusing more on getting the best deals for United States, and in some ways, it's a very short-term vision. It doesn't seem to have a lot of long-term depth in it. But at the same time, most other countries are going to respond the best for in terms of what is best for them and for their national interests. And looks like for United States or under Trump presidency, for them, what's more important is to respond to Republicans' weakening position within United States, as we are seeing in the other elections that are happening in the US. And then we'll see that in the midterms as well.
Yes.
There's a weakening position of Trump presidency, that's one. And two, US economy is also experiencing some sort of a slowdown. And, if none of these are curbed, it's likely to suffer more in the longer term. So given those trends, US, at least under President Trump, seems to be more focused on getting best deals rather than focused on maintaining US hegemony and the US-led global order. And given that their priorities have shifted, you will see, and we are witnessing a lot of other alternative powerhouses trying to fill that gap that has been left in the absence of US presence within the wider Indo-Pacific.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Dr. Asta Chadda. Always impressed by your vast knowledge and connecting these dots. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing that insight throughout our news, all the way from Kyoto. Now we move on to our next news. China says it is ready to deepen its partnership with Mongolia, as Premier Li Qiang met Mongolian Prime Minister Gombojav Zandan-Shatar in Moscow. Li has called the two nations close neighbors with shared interests and said Beijing wants to boost trade and expand cooperation in green energy and the digital economy. He has stressed that Mongolia remains a priority in China's neighborhood diplomacy and reaffirmed plans to build a community with a shared future. China also wants stronger ties in mining, energy infrastructure, and regional connectivity, including cooperation in the Altai sub-region. Mongolia, in return, has praised its long-standing friendship with China and reaffirmed its One China policy. Zandan-Shatar has also said that Mongolia is ready to align development strategies, advance major projects, and work more closely with China in regional as well as multilateral forums. Now we move on to Hong Kong. An investigation into a deadly plane crash in Hong Kong last month has found an engine of the aircraft accelerated after touching down. The Boeing 747, flown by Turkey-based ACT Airlines from Dubai, skidded after landing at the city's airport on October 20th and collided with security patrol car, sending both vehicles into the sea. 2 workers in the car were killed. The 4 crew members on the plane were unhurt. The report from the Air Accident Investigation Authority has listed the crash as an accident, saying its number 4 engine accelerated after landing. Examination of the flight deck showed thrust levels of number 1, 2, and 3. Engines were closed and their reverse thrust levers were selected to the maximum. Now we move on to Japan. A major fire in southwestern Japan has torn through more than 170 buildings, leaving 1 person missing. Local media say the blaze erupted in the Sanganoseki district of Oita City, forcing about 175 residents to evacuate to an emergency shelter. Fire officials say the cause is still under investigation. Today morning, crews were still struggling to contain the flames as the fire spread into nearby forested areas. Authorities warn conditions remain dangerous and search efforts for the missing person are still ongoing. And that's a wrap on the China report. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.